Good evening, Strong Stance listeners. I'm your host, Eli Strong. My wife and I recently took a trip down to New Orleans for a week, but just before we left, I was introduced to our next guest via a mutual friend on Facebook. And in a bizarre turn of events, he happens to live in New Orleans. So long story short, I got to meet him and talk about his amazing adventure that he's about to embark on. And I had to have him on to share it with the Strong Stance listeners. My guest is Basil Soper. Basil is a transgender writer, activist, feminist, and Southerner who wears his heart on his sleeve. He writes for Pride.com and Bear World and is the founder of Transilient. He wants to write a memoir eventually, and he can be reached at www.ncqueer.com. Basil, thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
Hey, Eli, I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, you know, there's so much that I want to talk to you about today, and definitely some things that I feel like our listeners are just going to be kind of super jazzed about hearing about. But first, I really just kind of want to talk about who is Basil. So what is your background? Like, how did you get involved in whatever makes you happy or what you're doing now? Like, what does previous events for Basil's life look like?
Yeah, well, I'm the oldest of 4 kids, and I have always been a really creative person ever since I can remember. So whether I was like directing plays or pretending to have my own radio show or whatever. But let's see, I was raised in South Carolina. I was raised in a really low income household. Both of my parents drank pretty alcoholically, and I came out as trans for the first time when I was 5. It didn't really go over very well in my household. So
I imagine that 5 is not an easy age to come out for especially in the
yeah.
South.
I was on my way to baseball practice with my dad, and it was a long argument about how there was no way that I could be a boy. And I actually didn't believe it until I was didn't realize that maybe there was something up that made me not look like a boy to the rest of the world when I was forced to play softball at 13 when they split leagues up and I was no longer allowed on the baseball league. And that was just like a very detrimental moment in my life. And so, I've always just been a really creative kid, and I actually ended up running away from home when I was 16 due to the levels of abuse in my household, and this was in South Carolina. And I went back to South Carolina. I went to Florida for a while. When I ran away, I went back to South Carolina. I finished high school, moved to Charleston with my first partner and friends, and after that didn't work out, I kind of floated around for a bit and ended up in Asheville, North Carolina when I was 20. There I got sober when I was 21. I was using a bevy of drugs to self-medicate, and I got clean, and I guess through that, after a couple of years of being in recovery, I got really involved with politics and LGBTQ activism. I'm thinking it was 2010. There was some LGBT bashings in Asheville, and I'd formed a rally around it called We're Not Bashful. About 500 people came out. It was very successful, and one of the first big LGBT events to happen in Asheville in terms of people taking a stance on something and showing up for LGBT people and saying that this isn't okay, basically. So out of that, I started an organization called Justice for All with some friends. It was a local nonprofit, and we basically educated folks. We had different really awesome events too for the community. We had dance parties, we did things like raise funds to get trans folks up to the Philadelphia Trans Health Conference. We did a gender neutral bathroom initiative. We would talk to local businesses and schools about LGBT work, give LGBT workshops and trans ones in specific. And we did a lot of work. I mean, anything you can think of. You know, we had like different rallies. We would work with different organizations on more intersectional issues like feminist issues, and we did stuff with Black Lives Matter. And, you know, we were just like a really strong presence and force. I came out as trans at 24, so right around the time that JUFA, or Justice for All, was doing a lot of work. And I started transitioning physically, medically at 25. I'm now 29. So I've been on hormones for about 4 years. And I left Asheville last spring. I went to New York, and I worked with All Out, which is an international LGBT organization that predominantly does work in other countries. Stuff like, we got like gay guys out of jail in Morocco for having like gay relationships because it's illegal there, and like we would get folks out of Jamaica, or like we got refugees out of Iraq who were LGBT. A lot of them were trans. We just would raise funds. I wrote copy for them, and when I was in New York, I was kind of like, maybe I'll go back to Asheville, but after leaving, I just realized it was time for me to move on, and I felt like being in a town where I transitioned was really hard, and I was like such a big presence there in terms of trans stuff. So like everyone knew that I was trans. Everyone would watch me transition. I'd also made like a really big ordeal at the college that I went to, because they wouldn't allow trans folks to use names that weren't their legal names on online learning applications like Moodle or any other kind of, and so it would out us, and I ended up having to get the ACLU involved and like do a massive petition, and eventually did get the rules changed. And well, stuff like that's really great. It's also just like hyper visibility without any humanization. You know what I mean? It's just like, I'm this trans person. I want these things to change, and this is how I feel. And, you know, so I would just be at Whole Foods or something, and like folks would come up to me and like talk about how brave I was, or like I'd get mean mugged because someone knew that I was trans or like whatever. And it just, I don't know, going to New York gave me a lot of autonomy where like I could choose to come out. Plus it was New York City, you know, it was like a lot of fun, and people there on a different wavelength. Like everyone's there working and wanting to do work. And I lived in a really great house in Crown Heights in Brooklyn with a bunch of other queer folks. And so I just decided that it was time to leave Asheville. And I'd gone back to Asheville basically just to get my stuff, and thought about going to New York. My sister lived in New Orleans. I really love New Orleans. My partner and I, when we first started dating, went to New Orleans and really had like a very romantic time, like kind of fell in love here. And so we were like, let's give New Orleans a shot. And so yeah, we've been in New Orleans for about 9 months, and it's been really good. So that's my background. Sorry, that was a mouthful.
No, I mean, it's actually amazing. I had no idea that you had lived in New York for a little while. I'm not sure, you know, if that was something that I had known or not, but you said that you've lived in New Orleans now for 9 months. So have you had your first taste of New Orleans summer yet, really?
Well, I'm just getting it now. I mean, it's been warm, you know, and like it was like a very warm winter, and I'm not used to that, because in Asheville even it snows. Growing up in South Carolina, I didn't really get, you know, cold weather either, but it was still like a little chillier than it gets here. So it's getting hot now. I haven't been able to sleep some nights, you know, and we're about to talk about the project I'm going to do, but I'm hitting the road, so I'm basically going to bounce this summer, and like I'm pretty excited to miss it. I'm definitely not really into humidity. But my hair looks great. Yeah. It's really made my hair look very it's given it a lot of volume and curls.
Of course, yeah. I'm originally from, you know, about as far south in Alabama as you can get, so I grew up with that humidity. And I mean, I sometimes miss it, but then, you know, when I moved to D.C., you get used to not having it as much. I mean, like, D.C.'s humid, but it's nowhere near as humid as down, you know, deep south. So, But, yeah, no, I totally feel you on that. So let me ask you, you know, you mentioned your parents, and you mentioned having to try to kind of find another, I don't know, support system, as it were, or just even on your own. So back then, whenever that was, and even up to now, like, what did your support network look like when you were a kid, when you were a teenager, when you were figuring things out in Nashville? Like, did you have a lot of support everywhere you went? Was it some places were better than others? I mean, like, what's your support network then and now?
I think that I've always had really great friends. Regardless of what I was into, even when I was like partying really hard and doing drugs and stuff. I've always had like a very communal vibe. In South Carolina, I had a great group of friends in high school who I still talk to. Like I still talk to I'm about to see a lot of them on this trip, and I still talk to my like first boyfriend. And like, coming from South Carolina, that's a lot to say. I went to an arts high school, actually. I went to like a vocational arts high school, which is helpful. The first 2 years of high school, I went to North Myrtle Beach High School, which was my, quote, base school. I got made fun of a lot. I didn't really have a lot of friends. I had, as a part of like the, quote, punk kids, we'd spend our weekends driving up to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, because they had the closest Hot Topic. There wasn't one in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina at this time. And, so I always had a tight group of friends. In high school we were really into like going to shows, and music was a big part of things, and it was good. And then after high school I stayed off and on in this punk house in Myrtle Beach, and like I was always kind of like a part of like a more political, punkish type community then. And then when I went to North Carolina, I still like music and hanging out, and community in that way was big. Like my friends that I had there, I was really loved and really supported, and I did have like a big empty hole in my heart for a long time because I didn't have a family of origin in my life. It wasn't until a couple years ago that I started talking to my sister again. She's the youngest, and it wasn't her fault. It was just like I couldn't have a relationship with her without my like really controlling father being involved. And I saw my mom for the first time in 10 years last year, and so now things are like a little different. But for a long time, I did have to make my own family in a lot of ways. And then, after I quit using and stuff, I started forming communities through the LGBT community in Asheville. And I still have so many friends from that. Currently, I don't have a whole lot of friends in New Orleans because I work a lot, but there are a few folks who I'm really close to, and I'm starting to get more involved with the trans community here. And it's just a little bit slower to like get really entrenched in the community here. But even when I was in New York, I was only in New York for 4 months, and I made a whole bunch of friends, and who I still talk to all the time. And, it was really easy for me there. So I've always just been able to, build a community around me. And it's always looked different, but it's always had similar qualities. There's always a lot of cooking, a lot of sharing, a lot of laughing. Music's been a big part of things, and, activism and politics have been a big part of it.
Right. Yeah, I feel like, that's one of the things that time and time again it's really shown that how difficult or easy our lives are a lot of times has to do with our support networks, right? And if we have that ability, or whether we are blessed with a family, either adoptive or biological, that provides that, it's wonderful. But if you can craft that, if you have that ability to build that for yourself and know this person is good for me and this person is not, that it can make such a big difference. But okay, so we talked about what you use with Just Us for All and working with All Out. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about